Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and joining me today is contributing editor Zack Fry, Associate Professor of Military History at the U.S. Command and General Staff College. I got to get all that officialness right, but to me, he's just my pal Zack. How you doing tonight?
Doing well. How are you, Chris?
I'm really glad to have you with us. I'm doing well. Thank you very much. So,
Good.
it's election day. This episode is going to appear on election day, and what better topic than to talk about the election of 1864? Because certainly the stakes were super high, and it's something that I think maybe a lot of people know a little bit about, but maybe don't know a whole lot about. And Zach is a great expert on this, so I thought I'd bring him in and talk a little bit about this. Zach, let's just set the table just clear and straight, pretend nobody knows anything. Who's on the ballot in 1864, and why are they squaring off?
The quick answer is Abraham Lincoln is running for re-election, and he is running against one of his former generals, or the general that perhaps he is best known for having fired earlier in the war, George McClellan, who is on the Democratic ticket. That's the short answer. The longer answer is that it is more complicated, and there's a lot going on in this election besides just Lincoln running against just McClellan. There's, of course, a lot of palace intrigue within Lincoln's administration early on about whether or not Lincoln should run for reelection because it had been a while since a president had actually run successfully for a second term, not since Andrew Jackson. And even within McClellan's Democratic Party, there's a lot of infighting that goes right up through and actually after their convention. And then that doesn't even include the third party candidate in the form of John C. Fremont, who runs on a party platform with the Radical Democracy, it's called, and he gets out finally in September 1864. So there's a lot going on in the 1864 election besides just sort of the traditional Lincoln versus McClellan contest. It's a mess.
And of course, the context for all this is essentially whether or not the war shall continue, or whether or not the new administration will sue for peace and on the basis of Confederate independence. Um, Being as far removed from that as we are today, 160 years later, um, how big were those stakes really?
Um, this is something that historians have argued about for a long time. And although it's been a while since we've had like a really good comprehensive treatment of the 64 election, um, there have been some pretty important books written about it. Um, and they come to sort of divergent conclusions about exactly how much was at stake. It used to be, historians said, for instance, that a McClellan administration, if such a thing ever happened after the 1864 election, might not have been all that much different in terms of its ultimate course, based on sort of how much of Union policy was baked in going into the 64 election, how much could really, realistically be changed. And then there are other historians who insist that pretty much everything, right up to the viability of Republican democracy itself was on the line, highlighting, for instance, the importance of actually holding a presidential election in the midst of a civil war, something we kind of take for granted when we look at the story. But of course, it wasn't foregone conclusion that there would be such an election, and it's perhaps to our everlasting national credit that there was such a test of our democracy in the middle of the larger test of our democracy, the American Civil War. Um, so there was a lot at stake. How different McClellan administration would have looked in the event that he actually won is certainly open to debate, and it's one of those kind of squishy counterfactuals it's hard to really get into in a serious way. But simply looking at it from the perspective of this is an election that happens in the middle of civil war, there's a lot at stake in it.
Now, I think people sort of go to that simple narrative that, Lincoln's going to continue the war, McClellan would sue for peace. But within the Democratic Party, there are, as you mentioned earlier, factions, and there are war Democrats and peace Democrats, and McClellan gets the nomination for his party because he's a big name celebrity, but he's
Yeah.
sort of a reluctant candidate in that, he's still kind of, you know, tied to that army that is still in the midst of this fight, and maybe doesn't want to quite give up the fight. Tell me a little bit about, what those intra-party dynamics look like for the Democrats.
Yeah, for the Democrats, it's ugly. It's definitely ugly because, as you mentioned, there are at least two wings in the Democratic Party that are driving the discussion. Um, I think there's a case to be made that the Democratic Party is actually even more complicated than just that. One historian, Matthew Gallman, has described it as a cacophony of politics, where there was just a never-ending complexity involved, and positions were always moving based on the fast pace of real-time events during the war. But yeah, the the party was divided very early on by the course that the war was taking. As early as 61, there were um, war Democrats, they were called, who sort of jumped ship from the Democratic Party and joined Lincoln's coalition, for lack of a better term, to prosecute the war for Union. And once emancipation started becoming a more central issue for the Lincoln administration's communication to the public about the war effort, the Democratic Party split, even more. Um, so you did end up with a pretty strident wing of the party, the Peace Democrats, that kind of gained quite a bit of traction and quite a bit of power by uh, late 1862, going into early 1863. And that was the real central tension within the Democratic Party. Who was going to essentially be the center of gravity for this party? Was it going to simply be a loyal opposition to the Lincoln administration, which abided by the broad contours of the Union war effort and said, yes, we are on board with putting down the rebellion. Treason is treason. We just disagree over, tactical issues with the Lincoln administration? Or was it going to be something more in line with what the Peace Democrats wanted, where they were calling out the Lincoln administration for kind of twisting the war effort into something it was never intended to be, a war for emancipation, for flagrantly assaulting civil rights of Northerners, um, for pushing national conscription and dragging people into the war who never wanted to be part of it. So it got very ugly. And the 1864 Democratic Convention carried all that ugliness right into the hall there in Chicago, where there was a struggle between those who were in favor of kind of maintaining a more loyal posture to the Union, if not to the administration, obviously, or those who wanted to treat it as a referendum on the war itself, to the extent that they were, in fact, willing to sanction something like an armistice or a patched up peace with the Confederacy, um, even up to and including recognition of Confederate independence if the case demanded it. So you had McClellan representing generally the more loyal wing of the Democratic Party, the party that treated it kind of as a party of loyal opposition. And then you had the Clement Vallandigham and the Copperhead wing of the party that pushed for a pro peace, a strong pro peace platform. And as a result of this tension, the Democrats put forth McClellan as a candidate, McClellan as the nominee, with a peace Democrat and friend of Vallanningham's, guy from Ohio named George Pendleton, as the vice presidential nominee. And on top of it all, the party platform went so far as to call the war a failure. So it was a kaleidoscope of viewpoints on the war, and a very uneasy alliance. McClellan himself went through 6 or 7 drafts of an acceptance letter before he ultimately said, I can't really accept this platform the way it's written, but I will nonetheless, put my shoulder to the wheel and try to win this contest for the Democratic Party, all things considered. So it was a real mess in Chicago when the Democrats met in 64.
I've got to think for McClellan, that's a really tough spot to be in. Like the platform calls the war a failure. He was in charge of the military effort for a long time. And so to accept that it's a failure, it seems like he would have to, at some level, accept that part of that's his fault. And I can't see McClellan. I can't see McClellan being
Well,
the guy that's like, well, yeah, I got
that's an interesting way to put it. Yeah, that's a very interesting way to put it, that he has to accept some blame for it. The fact that the convention comes, though, in late August, and at a point when I think a lot of historians correctly identify was maybe the low tide of the Union war effort for the entire war. The late summer of 64, when Grant is stalled outside Richmond and Petersburg, Sherman is stalled outside Atlanta. Nothing else seems to really be materializing for the Union war effort. There is a sense, I think, on the part of McClellan's supporters, and to the extent that McClellan embodied this notion as well, I think is probably I think that he probably did, that the bungling of 1864, the bloodshed of 1864, was proof, in fact, that McClellan's approach to the war had been the right one. McClellan's inbox, if you look at his letters in the Library of Congress, is being flooded with well-wishers, supporters, party faithful, and editors screaming that it has taken Grant 50,000 men and 6 weeks of carnage during the Overland campaign to get to the gates of Richmond, when McClellan had got there through his expeditionary campaign in 1862 with very little contest and bloodshed to account for it. So I think there was a sense among some of the party faithful that McClellan's approach to the war, had it not been for Lincoln recalling him from the peninsula, was actually very close to working. And that's something that McClellan's supporters always said. McClellan was always this close to winning the war, no matter which example, no matter which period we're talking about. He's this close to winning the war in July of 62. He's this close to winning the war when Lincoln fires him in November of 62. So that's just sort of par for the course.
And of course, there's no way to disprove that because he's released from
Exactly.
command, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
So now you mentioned that low point of the summer of 64. Of course, Lincoln writes that letter to himself that he then has his cabinet sign, sight unseen, puts it away. Tell us a little bit about that letter and how serious do you think he was as he wrote that letter?
Well, Lincoln was definitely prone to bouts of depression, as I'm sure listeners know. And the nadir of the Union war efforts in 1864 brings that out. But it's not just that Lincoln himself is feeling this. Others in the Republican Party, or as it is being called in the 1864 campaign, the National Union Party, and maybe that's something we could talk about as well, that change, which I think is actually more than just cosmetic. Um, Lincoln, his inbox is being flooded with supporters and editors telling him, as in fact the chairman of the party did in August of 64, that it might in fact be better for the party and for the country if Lincoln were to step aside. So that's in the mix as well during this low point of the war. And so, yes, in the third week of August, Lincoln sits down and writes a very simple, straightforward memorandum of sorts, where he in effect says that the the vibes, as we would say in 2024, seem to be going against us, right? If Lincoln is scrolling through Twitter, he's seeing a lot of stuff from from Nate Silver and Politico and everything, talking about how, he's toast, it's over. And McClellan, or whomever the Democratic nominee is going to be, because the Democratic convention hasn't officially happened yet. Lincoln's Twitter feed is full of lots of depressing hot takes on the war effort. So Lincoln writes this memorandum and says, it looks like we're not going to be reelected. And then it'll be my duty to cooperate with the president-elect to try to save the Union between November, when the election is, and March, when the inauguration is. Because if somebody like McClellan is elected, and I'm paraphrasing now, if somebody like McClellan is elected, he will only have been elected on a platform of, we can't win the war. So I've shown it to students sometimes when I teach an elective on Grant's campaign in 1864, because I think it represents Lincoln's reaction to the lack of immediate success that Grant's campaign has. And sometimes they're perplexed by it. They're like, what is he really saying here? And I've grappled myself with it a lot, and tried to really wrap my mind around all the implications of what Lincoln is suggesting there. But I think he's really, above all, committing himself and his cabinet, which is why he has them all sign it sight unseen, as you mentioned, Chris. He's committing to a peaceful transfer of power. And that's a powerful, powerful example in the middle of a civil war when, as I mentioned, we take it as foregone conclusion that there would have been an election, but there might not have been. He's committing himself to the peaceful transfer of power, to abiding by the will of the people, and saying, if somebody like McClellan is elected, I have to do my level damnedest to make sure we save the Union, but I will leave office.
Yeah. To me, it's one of the most extraordinary moments in his entire administration, because it really is, I think, a gut check moment for Lincoln, and he kind of puts it on the table and makes this pledge that he didn't have to make under these extraordinary circumstances. And considering that he had done other things in the administration to, suspend habeas corpus and some of those civil rights things you mentioned, like he could have used that as a justification to also suspend things, and he doesn't, and that's a huge moment.
Right. Absolutely. No, he doesn't. And the election goes forward. And of course, it's, spoiler alert, it's a resounding victory for the Lincoln administration. But yeah, there are periods in 1864 when it seems like the administration is totally on the ropes, and this war effort, which had been, things had been looking better in late 63, early 64. Things now look incredibly bleak. And I imagine for Lincoln and for those around him, there may have been the temptation to suspend the political process, but he does not do it.
So we've talked a little bit about the dynamics of the Democratic Party, but Lincoln, as you've alluded to, is in the midst of a maelstrom of all sorts of competing interests within the Republican Party, or the newly christened National Union Party. Tell us a little bit about some of those contending sides.
Right. Well, the Union war effort, ever since Fort Sumter, had been um, sort of a rally around the flag experience for Northerners, or I should say, it was at the beginning, and then the sort of procession of military failures over the course of 62 and early 63 really tested that unity. And so, as the Democratic Party gained a lot of traction in the early part of the war in 62 and early 63, um, that rally around the flag sentiment, that sort of the sentiment expressed by some Northern politicians that we know no party now in the middle of a civil war, that faded away, and party resurfaced, as it often does in American politics. And so Lincoln was, I think, trying to resuscitate that a little bit in 1864. There were lots of Northern states where Union parties had started to thrive. during the war, such as in Pennsylvania, where Andrew Curtin had really nourished a strong Union Party there, kind of in an effort to isolate the Democrats, and it worked very effectively for him during the 63 gubernatorial race. And also in Ohio, where something very similar happened. And the Republican Party rebranded itself the Union Party in 1863 for their governor's race and actually nominated a war Democrat, John Brough, who ended up winning against Clement Vallandigham in 1863, the Peace Democrat that we just talked about. So um, Lincoln recognizes, and others around him do as well, that there has been some success at the state level with building union parties as kind of an alternative to, strictly speaking, the Republican Party in an effort to convey to voters that this is something that putting down the rebellion should not be a time for nursing partisan injuries and partisan identity. Um, and in early 1864, as the state conventions are coming together to nominate um, local and state offices and electors for the presidential contest, it's pretty clear that this is going to be a national union party now, not a Republican Party. And we're not entirely sure just like how much Lincoln himself had a hand in that. That's kind of a gray area. A lot of it has to do with the proliferation of what were called union leagues,
Mm.
these political clubhouses and organizations, um, big and small throughout the North. There were big ones in New York City and Philadelphia, but also small chapters, loosely affiliated across the North in smaller towns, which were really all about ginning up support for the war effort and, in effect, supporting the Lincoln administration. Um, and Lincoln may have had a hand in that as well. We're not entirely sure. But I think to his credit, Lincoln and those around him realize that maybe the National Union movement isn't just going to be some flash in the pan, experience in American politics. Maybe, and this tracks back to a very influential essay that a historian named Michael Holt wrote, maybe the National Union Party is the birth of something fundamentally new in the American political experience, or at least something that hasn't been true in American politics for several years, which is a national party that can put some of these sectional divides behind us. Um, and so I think Lincoln and Republicans are looking ahead to just what exactly is the United States going to look like after this war if we prevail. Maybe the Republican Party isn't going to cut it because the Republican Party was a sectional party. And I think the National Union Party, if you look at the dynamics that play out between the party leadership at the national level and some of these states, like the border states where there are strong union parties, like some of these southern states that are in the middle of what we call wartime reconstruction, where Lincoln is really trying to pitch a very broad tent to expand the old Republican Party maybe into something a little bit more forward looking. So that's what's playing out in the Republican Party as it rebrands itself the National Union Party. It's not without dissension. It's not without a lot of controversy because Lincoln at one point is the subject of, I mentioned some palace intrigue. Um, there are efforts within the Lincoln administration in the spring, late winter, early spring of 64, to actually pitch something like a Salmon Chase candidacy in Lincoln's stead. That comes to grief in fairly short order. So it's not without controversy and it's not without some problems, but ultimately going forward, I think the National Union label was maybe more than just a label. It was maybe actually something that Lincoln did think was going to be the future of his party.
And a lot of people forget, like the Republican Party was still relatively new at that point,
Very new.
still in the process of becoming whatever it's going to become. So there is that opportunity for ongoing evolution and change. Yet they end up as Republicans, by the time Grant runs for office.
Right.
Why do they revert back to that identity?
That's a good question. I think the turmoil of Reconstruction and the fact that um, Andrew Johnson becomes president, and Andrew Johnson, even though he was elected as Lincoln's VP under the National Union banner, was a war Democrat. Probably had a lot to do with that, and I think the the um, the viability of a National Union Party, which Johnson tried to hang on to through at least the 1866 midterms, um, it became more of kind of a nakedly partisan effort to hang on to whatever viability Andrew Johnson had as chief executive, particularly as the gap between Johnson and the Republicans in Congress widened. So the National Union Party does not last very long. It is not long for this world when Lincoln is reelected. Um, and I think the the Lincoln's demise, his death in April 1865, and then Johnson assuming the presidency is spelling its doom.
I want to explore this idea of rebranding just a second too, as because you talked about, um, the union leagues and this idea of continuing the war effort on behalf of the union.
Mhm.
And I can't help but think, like, the war starts off as preserving the union. The Emancipation Proclamation really reframes the war in significant ways, and that made a lot of Lincoln's coalition pretty uncomfortable. So then the idea of kind of recentering as this union identity again to kind of put that war effort back in the forefront. I mean, to me, that's
Mhm.
fascinating. And I think people kind of go from the union sentiment at the beginning to the Emancipation Proclamation, reframing it. But then that third step, a lot of people kind of forget about that third step.
That's true. The National Union Party label is at least communicating. We can't overlook the fact that it's not rebranded into the Emancipation Party. It's rebranded into the National Union Party. The assumption there, in the very name of the party itself, is that union is the overarching goal of the war effort, and that can't be denied. Um, what I think is important to recognize, though, is that um, very early on in the creation of this National Union Party, as early as December 63, January 64, if you look at the kind of the early state and local level conventions, um, this is going to be a continuation of the Republican Party's anti slavery stance. They are not jettisoning emancipation. That would have been unthinkable, certainly by late 1863, early 1864. Um, in fact, as the process unfolds, and perhaps partly in response to some of that intrigue within Lincoln's administration between a more radical alternative like Chase or radical alternatives outside the party like John C. Fremont, the National Union Party pretty readily and quickly adopts a platform that says we are in favor of a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery. That's front and center. So the National Union Party, even though its name indicates the overarching goal of national union, once you get past that and look at all of the conventions, all of the proclamations and meetings and everything that's being communicated and put out there by the party, emancipation is absolutely part and parcel of union. They are inseparable.
I like the phrase you used earlier, like treason's still treason. So, even if
Mm.
if people are uncomfortable about the emancipation issue, like treason's still treason, and we still have to kind of
Yeah.
make sure that we're addressing that. You mentioned John Fremont a second ago, and how does he fit into this or not fit into this, I guess is the case is better expressed, because like he's one of the founders of the Republican Party. He's their first candidate for
Yeah,
president. And now
he's a big deal.
he finds himself kind of odd man out as all of this is coming together.
He's a big deal, and his candidacy is the result of efforts by disparate groups of radicals within the wartime North, very much disenchanted with Lincoln for moving too slowly on emancipation. It really is about emancipation, full stop.
Yeah.
Fremont's candidacy is almost entirely about putting emancipation um, more front and center, even than it was in Lincoln's own mind and in his own policy. And that list of groups that's pushing John C. Fremont includes um, organizations like women's loyal leagues, who are very much committed to the war effort and are long-standing reform groups within Northern politics, and they don't think that Lincoln necessarily represents a forward-looking or a radical enough vision for the war. Um, to what extent they were simply trying to threaten the Lincoln administration into adopting a more radical posture is open to debate. But they talked to Fremont pretty early. And the other group, which is absolutely central to Fremont's candidacy, and any of your listeners who know anything about Fremont's wartime service will not be surprised by this: German Americans. German Americans from across the North, but also and especially focused on the German American community in Missouri. They are out in front pushing for a Fremont third party candidacy. And I think Lincoln administration kind of initially downplays it, kind of says like, "Oh, you can't be serious. This isn't happening." And then I came across this great letter from Carl Schurz, who, of course, was a Lincoln supporter, where he's describing to it's either Lincoln or someone within his administration, no, these guys are in earnest. They will move to nominate John C. Fremont. And Fremont was a big deal, as you alluded to. He had been the Republican nominee in 1856 and had, not necessarily, been all that close to winning, but the Republicans put in a pretty good showing in 1856. He did pretty well for a brand new party on the scene. Um, and so he is a threat to be taken seriously. Um, the Radical Democracy, as the party is called, that meets in Cleveland on May 31st, 1864, a week before the National Union Party meets in Baltimore, um, is a real mess, though. It is clear that in trying to broaden the tent, in trying to build a big tent themselves, the supporters of Fremont reached out to other groups, including some which wanted to nominate Ulysses S. Grant. Can you imagine that? Right? Grant is his name is being thrown around as a possible alternative to Lincoln. Um, and so there are these other groups that are sort of arriving in Cleveland thinking, oh, my guy is going to be the alternative to Lincoln. Um, and then once the Fremont people, once it becomes clear, once the writing is on the wall that Fremont is going to be the nominee of this rogue convention in Cleveland, everybody else sort of jumps ship, and we end up with this really weird. I don't know how else to describe it, and other historians basically say the same thing, that it's like this is a political contradiction in terms. You end up with Fremont on a platform calling for abolition of slavery, up to and including civil rights for freed African Americans. And we're going to go over and give the Copperheads, an extended hand and say, yeah, Lincoln did too much to assault civil liberties and stuff. So that too. And they nominate a war Democrat named John Cochran for vice president, who was a Union general and big time politician from the state of New York, a Democrat of long standing in New York state politics. It's a weird experiment, and it doesn't go very far. By September of 64, Fremont says, this isn't working, so I'm going to pull the plug on it. And there's probably a backroom deal with Lincoln where basically what Fremont gets out of it is his sort of Missouri politics nemesis, um, Montgomery Blair, gets pushed out of Lincoln's cabinet. So that's kind of the backroom deal that goes on. I'm not sure that Fremont was angling for that the entire time. I think to a certain extent he was in earnest about his chances, but it didn't go very far. It's a weird experiment, though.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned that hot minute where Grant's name gets floated, and Lincoln actually has to clear that up before he'll promote Grant to lieutenant general. And that's
Yeah.
really where Grant says, "No, I'm all in
Yep.
this for Lincoln," and that's really kind of what seals that deal for them. But it was an odd little moment there as Lincoln sort of looking at his top general as potentially being a rival.
It was incredibly embarrassing, I think, for Grant, considering that you had big time editors like James Gordon Bennett um, of the New York Herald uh, pushing Grant's possible candidacy in the winter of 1864, the uh, early period in 1864, as a possible alternative to Lincoln. This is among the most widely read newspapers in the United States, and it's pushing for this guy who is, on the table to become lieutenant general, to take over command of all Union forces, to be launching the great campaign against Lee, as the guy who's now going to become the Democrat, Republican, third party candidate for president. In addition to everything else, all the other expectations and responsibilities Grant had on his shoulders in early 1864, there's that as well. So yeah, Grant has to like back channel to Lincoln saying, no, this is not going to happen. I don't know how this got started. And it's not the sort of false humility like we get from a guy like Salmon Chase. I don't know how this happened. Um, it's genuine, and I think it was embarrassing, possibly for Grant for a hot minute there. But yeah, it fades away pretty quickly. Fortunately for him, because he's got other things going on.
And a similar dynamic, but I guess in reverse, happens with Lincoln and McClellan at sort of midway through the summer of '64, where Lincoln's
Yeah.
looking for a solution in the Shenandoah Valley, and like, oh, do we recall McClellan and put him in charge of that effort? And Lincoln's like, well, no, I don't want to give a military success to someone who's potentially going to be a rival either. Uh,
No, but you raise an interesting point. I think, sort of implicitly there, which is we cannot. Whatever you're drinking looks good, by the way.
Diet Mountain Dew.
Okay. I thought it was something else. Never mind. We can't fathom a general in uniform running for president. That is unthinkable to us. You're not even permitted to be Secretary of Defense unless an appropriate period of time has passed after you've left uniform, to take up a civilian post within the executive branch like that. So we can't fathom um, a a general in active service running for president. McClellan was. McClellan was still wearing the uniform. He had been fired by Lincoln as Field Army Commander of the Army of the Potomac, and he was sitting at home in Trenton, New Jersey, and then in New York City, basically, waiting for a job, but still collecting a paycheck from the United States Army. And so there's always that possibility that Lincoln can recall him, and in doing so, potentially nullify him as a potential candidate because he'd have bigger things, more immediate things at least, to worry about. But yeah, that's part of what's so fascinating about the 1864 election. In addition to the fact that it happens in a time of war, which is significant, you have a major general in uniform who's running at the top of the ticket for one of the parties, and you have a guy who had been a Union general earlier in the war as a third party candidate, along with a guy who had been a general earlier in the war as his running mate, John C. Fremont and John Cochrane, and then Ulysses S. Grant being thrown around as a potential alternative as well. So it is a deeply militarized, for lack of a better term, election.
So we've talked sort of about the context here, but let's look at Lincoln and McClellan sort of as candidates. And a lot of us know about Lincoln as president. We know about McClellan as a general. What were these two men like as political candidates?
Well, um, Lincoln, I think, as was custom back then, took a sort of a hands-off approach to the campaign itself. He allowed his surrogates in the form of editors and party chairmen at various levels to do most of the politicking for him. And that was very standard for the day. It would have been considered unseemly for a political candidate to actively campaign for office. Um, Again, something which is very strange by our reckoning, but which was nonetheless the case in 1864 and had been for decades. Had been for decades. Um, so he was a rather hands off candidate, but of course that didn't mean that he wasn't the subject of a tremendous amount of adulation on the part of the people, on the part of his supporters, and that included, as it turned out, thousands of men in the army who were willing to vote for him over the man who had been, for many of them at least, in the Army of the Potomac, their one-time commander. Um, as for McClellan, it's a similar story in that he's also adopting kind of a hands-off approach to the campaign. He has his political handlers, for lack of a better term. They include men like Samuel Barlow, who was a prominent Democratic Party chairman, um, uh, of of, um, had been for quite some time, a prominent figure in the party, and newcomers to the scene like McClellan's friend Manton Marble, who was editor of the New York World. Marble, about the same age as McClellan, they were both in their mid to late 30s. Um, and Marble and others were sort of coaching McClellan on how to do this, what to say, what to communicate, when not to say things. Um, and so McClellan, like Lincoln, was leaving a lot of that up to his surrogates. Unlike Lincoln, McClellan was a complete political neophyte in the sense of never having run for office. That didn't mean that he didn't have political inclinations and deeply held beliefs. He was somewhat ideological in that sense. He was an old line Whig, um, who became, and Lincoln was an old line Whig too, but where Lincoln moved from old line Whig into um, Republican, into the Republican Party by the 1850s. McClellan moved from old line Whig into the Douglas Democrat camp, the Northern Democratic camp, and then from there into the War Democratic camp once the war started. So he did have his political inclinations and everything, but the actual act of politicking, of being a candidate, was something very new to him. I'm not sure he was ever entirely comfortable with it. I'm not sure he was ever entirely good at it. Certainly not as good at it as Lincoln was. But in some ways, that's the undeniable result of the fact that he's being given a horrible situation. McClellan is. He's being given a platform that he subscribes to and loses half the Democratic Party, or a platform he rejects and risks losing the party leadership, um, like Bellanningham and others who seem to be on board with this sort of thing. So it's a really no-win situation. And it's best encapsulated by the political cartoons that show him trying to straddle two horses, one named war and one named peace. So Lincoln is definitely a better communicator than McClellan. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But McClellan was nonetheless being coached as well as could be expected by his political handlers in the Democratic Party and in the Democratic press. Um, and so that's basically what I think they bring to the table as candidates on the campaign trail.
Now we can have a whole episode about the actual mechanics of the election itself and the soldier voting and all that sort of stuff. Um, So, without having to get too far into those weeds, um, how does the election go from a mechanics point of view, from a logistics point of view? Is it contentious? Is there a moment it might not happen? Does it go relatively smoothly? What are the dynamics of the army?
The election is certainly not without controversy. You wouldn't expect it to be. It's an election in the middle of civil war. There is the awful specter of civil unrest within the northern home front. There are flare ups of Copperhead activity in 1864, um, and the threat of worse flare ups of Copperhead activity, something that historians have debated for a long time. Just how real was the threat of Copperhead sedition? And I mean real sedition, trying to overthrow state governments, trying to overthrow the national government, trying to inflict domestic terrorism across the North. Um, and for a long time, through the work of historians like Frank Clement, who wrote innumerable books about the Copperheads in the Midwest, um, the notion was sort of that this was kind of a ploy or a tactic on the part of Republicans and National Union folks to misrepresent the truth. Like they were creating a boogeyman where there really wasn't one. The Copperheads were never really a big enough deal to do that sort of damage. And, these sort of shadowy secret societies like the Knights of the Golden Circle or whatever, yeah, they were real, but at the same time, they never really did anything. And I'm maybe exaggerating that view a little bit, but not that much. I think more recent work by folks like Jennifer Weber and Stephen Town, I think is his name, um, has shown pretty significantly that there was something to a lot of these rumors and a lot of this um, fear that pervaded, especially the Midwest, leading into the 1864 election. That law enforcement officials and um, figures within the United States Army who were tasked with commanding those districts, responsible for recruiting, responsible for organizing units and dealing with the bureaucracy there and everything, facilitating conscription, all of that stuff. Um, they were well aware of these threats and they worked as well as they could to keep tabs on them, report them the um, to the Lincoln administration, um, and deal with them when they became an issue. Um, there may have been quite a bit of at least attempted coordination between some of these disloyal or dissenting groups of Copperheads across the Midwest um, and Confederate agents. We don't exactly know. I think the record on that is sketchy and probably relies a lot more on innuendo than some historians would like. But it was the point here is that there was a lot of ambiguity, there was a lot of uncertainty and unrest in the North. Um, of course, there's an attempt to burn New York City to the ground, by Copperhead seditious elements that doesn't really work. I mean, it's scary, but it doesn't do what they hoped it would accomplish. Um, and in spite of all of that, the election comes off fairly quietly. It really does. There are not large scale riots on election day. There is not rampant voter fraud, although partisan newspapers at the time doing what partisan newspapers did. And I don't even have to say partisan newspapers because there wasn't any other type of newspaper in the 1860s. They existed purely to communicate talking points to voters. There were allegations of fraud. None of them ever substantiated with any, you know, with any real evidence. Um, and of course, these are being pushed by the Democratic Party because they're the losers in the 64 election. Um, and a lot of those allegations center on the Army vote, of course, as you alluded to. The Army, or at least large parts of it, were allowed to vote in the 64 election. Not all the states. Democrats in state legislatures had pushed um, efforts to block soldier voting in 1862, 63, and 64. Um, and so not all the states got to vote, or not all states volunteers got to vote at the front, but most of them did. And they cast their vote pretty decisively for Lincoln, and in a manner that I think is is relatively straightforward. That doesn't necessarily include all of the. It doesn't necessarily include a great deal more cajoling or intimidation than voting generally did across the United States in the mid 19th century, which could still be substantial. They didn't necessarily have a secret ballot like we do today. You got a party ballot, you got a party ticket, and dropped it in the box. So people could know who you were voting for. That could be intimidating. Um, but at the same time, I think people in the mid 19th century were generally used to that practice and behaved accordingly. So the election went off fairly quietly, despite all of the turmoil and sort of ambiguity that had surrounded it for so many weeks.
Now, you had spoiled the ending for us earlier and
Yes.
told us Lincoln won. How does he get to that point after writing that letter that he's saying I'm about to lose? What's the tipping point that you see? Or
There are a couple of them. The clear turning point after the blind memorandum, and it comes only about a week after the blind memorandum, um, is well, first of all, I would say on August 29th and 30th and 31st, the the Democrats nominate McClellan and Pendleton. And I'm saying that kind of tongue in cheek, but in reality, the Democrats um, hamstringing their own party with a with a sort of a schizophrenic policy and platform and candidates was in itself a huge unforced error that benefited Lincoln. So that is important. But also, of course, 2 days after 2 days after the Democrats declare the war a failure in their platform, Atlanta falls to Sherman, and that is a real blow to Democratic chances. There's no doubt about that. And Democrats maybe never recovered from that blow, even if they did have a decent chance at success against Lincoln. So by September, things which had been looking bleak for the Lincoln administration really do start to turn. The vibes start to change. The Twitter feed starts to change. People start to get a little bit more buoyant about Lincoln's chances. Although I think it's worth noting that McClellan is still an attractive candidate for millions of Northern voters who considered themselves Democrats, loyal, but Democrats. And his candidacy continued to attract attention and support through the election. And he did fairly well, all things considered, in the popular vote, losing 55 to 45%. I mean, nowadays we would consider that a pretty significant landslide. We don't anticipate that sort of thing anymore in American politics. In the Electoral College, it was a decisive victory, though, for Lincoln. McClellan won 3 states. He won, embarrassingly enough, Lincoln's home state of Kentucky, but the politics of Kentucky were deeply, deeply divided and probably unfriendly to the Republicans or the National Union Party anyway. The other thing I would say that can't be ignored is that as the the vibes started to change in Lincoln's favor, I think the last nail in the coffin for the Democrats and for McClellan probably was the not insignificant little victories that Sheridan won in the Shenandoah Valley, um, especially Cedar Creek on October 19th. I think that was a big deal in terms of signaling that victory is now possible in the Virginia theater of operations and that something is going to break. So I think Sherman's capture of Atlanta the victories in the Shenandoah Valley signal that the military dimension of the war is really starting to move in the right direction for the National Union Party.
So as we head into the home stretch here, anything I haven't asked you about this election that you really think people should walk away with?
Well, I think the most important thing that stands out to me, kind of as I reflect on the 64 election, is this idea that it's not as simple as you think it is. It's much more chaotic than you think it is. And in effect, when you look at when you look at mid 19th century politics, how could it not be? The Civil War happened because of schisms within the national parties that could no longer um, deal with a sectional issue like slavery. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that this political or partisan chaos lingers into the 1864 election, and as the Union war effort seems to be coming to grief, as it actually grows, the chaos does. Um, and so it's much more complicated than you think. You'd be amazed, just as kind of a little aside or a soapbox of mine, how often we seem to hear in the dialogue today that the Civil War was Republicans versus Democrats. The Republicans were in the North, they were against slavery. The Democrats were in the South, they were for slavery. The Democrats seceded, that's the Confederacy. That that view is both incredibly flawed and I think an incredible disservice to the realities of wartime politics in the North, where a very strong and very vibrant Democratic Party continued to exist throughout the course of the war. Um, a party that was so vigorous that it included everybody from Clement Vallandigham, who runs for governor of Ohio in absentia because he's been banished from the United States for being a traitor, to the guy they nominate for president, a major general wearing the United States Army uniform. That's the Democratic Party. And so to say that, the Civil War is just Democrats versus Republicans and the North is Republican, the South is Democrat. And I'm not saying that's ubiquitous, but it is something that you hear every once in a while. Deeply, deeply misses the point of how chaotic Northern politics really were. And that includes the chaos within the Democratic Party that injured it so badly going into the 1864 election.
And I'll throw out someone like Benjamin Butler, who's also part of that same party.
We
And
haven't even talked about him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, final thought, anything that we could consider today, without getting partisan or political, but anything that we could consider today as a lesson that modern Americans can take away from this election from 1864?
Well, yes, divorcing myself entirely from partisan politics because I am an employee of the Department of Defense, and nothing I say is necessarily the position of the United States government. I have to put that in there. I would say the most important lesson from the 1864 election is going back to our discussion about the blind memorandum. Lincoln's commitment in the middle of civil war and at the low point of the conflict for this man and for this administration. He commits himself, pledges his administration, his cabinet, to the notion of a peaceful transfer of power. That is a landmark example in American political history. And it's one that we desperately, desperately need to hear more of.
That's a powerful lesson and one of many great examples Lincoln's always speaking to us today with. So, Zach, this has been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today.
Absolutely. Anytime, Chris.
Always a pleasure. I'm Chris Mackowski on behalf of Zack Fry. Thanks for being with us here on the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.